So it's really important to target your literacy instruction for your student-specific needs. And one of the best ways to be able to do this is to really understand where they have areas of strength and weakness. And so one of the things that we like to do is we like to conceptualize where specifically a student is breaking down and what's causing them the most difficulty in their reading and writing skills. So, as always, we like to use a literacy processing triangle to be thinking about this. So we know that students may be breaking down in semantics, the meaning of words. They may be breaking down in orthography, so the recognition that a visual symbol is actually a letter, and so they might be struggling with letter reversals or things like that, just the visual component. Or they may be struggling with phonology, so the sound component, and really tying sounds to their respective letters. And so what we like to think about is when we're looking at data, so whether that be IEP eligibility data or an assessment, we want to be able to have an idea of how things really come together in each of these areas. Typically, what we'll do is just go ahead and give a check mark on any area that needs some work or that may be causing difficulty for that student. So, starting at semantics, if we're looking at something like expressive vocabulary, perhaps if we've had speech-language testing or we've seen on the WISC, for example, or the Wyatt, or any other assessment that might give you just kind of a brief picture of expressive vocabulary, if those scores are falling low, so we're thinking at or below the 16th percentile for performance, we're going to go ahead and give that a check. Same thing for receptive vocabulary, listening comprehension. When we speak of oral expression, we're thinking more of a student's ability to put together a syntactically and grammatically correct oral sentence. So some of our students may be struggling with that, and that would be an area that we would want to go ahead and give a check. Then moving to the other side of that semantics, we can also be struggling with reading comprehension, written composition, or morphology. So the understanding of those prefixes, suffixes, those Greek and Latin root patterns, and then how those are being appropriately tied into reading, writing, or spoken language. And so again, anytime that we have assessments that would be measuring any of those core components, so we're thinking again, the Wyatt, the Woodcock-Johnson, any of your academic tests should be giving you really a clear picture of reading or writing ability. Morphology is a little bit more tricky. We don't necessarily have a lot of great assessments at this point, but there are a number of speech-language assessments that will give you a good idea of whether or not students are really understanding those prefixes, those suffixes, and how to use those appropriately with language. Then we want to be thinking, once we move out of that semantics category, if our students are struggling with any orthographic concepts. So again, this is the print concepts. So if you have a student who's struggling to retain sight words in their reading and spelling, that's an orthography deficit. If they are struggling with letter reversal, so B's, D's, P's, Q's, that's another thing that we want to be able to target, with orthographic intervention. And then also if they're struggling with handwriting, oftentimes this is more of something that would be dealt with a occupational therapist. However, it is something to keep in mind because it can create a lot of difficulty if they're struggling so much with their handwriting that they can no longer read their writing. That becomes a big issue. So those are things to keep in mind. Then we're going to move all the way over to phonology. So again, that's understanding of our sound structure of our language. So this is going to be things like phonological awareness. Do they understand how words break into syllables and sounds? Auditory discrimination. Can they tell the difference between similar sounding words? Can, cam, are those the same or different? Things like that. You can also even do nonsense words. If you know that a student is struggling, for example, with the TH and F, you could say bath, bath, same or different. And really you just want to see if they can tell the difference between those similar sounds in words. That can create a big difficulty in reading and spelling if they're not processing the difference in those sounds. And then articulation is another clear struggle area for a lot of our students. And this can also create difficulty with that phonological loop. So if you're a speech language pathologist, that might be a great thing to go ahead and tick off. If you're not, if you are a special education teacher or you work primarily with literacy, you can definitely still check that and just make sure that you're letting parents know that this is an area that will impact their reading and writing if it's not addressed, and then go ahead and refer to the appropriate professional. Then what we want to think about is we want to think about the connection between orthography and phonology. So that connection between orthography and phonology is really the ability to sound out words for both reading and spelling. So of course, reading and writing are just reciprocal processes. So it's just two sides of the same coin. And so oftentimes if a student is struggling with reading, they're having a hard time blending sounds together, they may also have difficulty pulling sounds apart. Sometimes you'll get students who are really strong in decoding, but really struggle with encoding, spelling. And sometimes, even more surprisingly, you can get students who show the opposite profile as well. But regardless, that is a connection between orthography and phonology. And oftentimes, those are going to be the kids who are referred, and so we would be checking one or both of those boxes. And then, of course, once we combine this entire triangle together, when we're combining your semantics, orthography, phonology together, we need to be thinking about how fluent that connection is happening. Really, we need to have this coming together in less than half of a second to be able to comprehend what we're reading and to be able to really produce really strong written language at the pace at which it needs to happen to keep up with the classmates. So it may be the case that all of these skills in isolation are fine, but fluency is a big struggle. And so that would be an area that we would want to be targeting. Additionally, executive functioning is another really huge component that we can't leave out because students need to self-monitor whether or not what they're saying makes sense, whether or not they've followed along with the paragraph or a story. Can they monitor that they're not actually understanding or they're not comprehending? If they're writing, are they paying attention to capitals, punctuation, spelling? All of those things are really executive functioning skills that students will need to develop as well. So what we need to be thinking about is we need to be thinking about where all of these check marks will be happening, and we need to be thinking about how many check marks do we have. Clearly, the more check marks that we have, the longer and the slower it's going to take to be able to fully remediate a student. And in some cases, if we have check marks in every single box, what we may have to understand is that they may never be able to read and write at the same level as their peers. And so we may want to take a look at what type of accommodations and modifications can we start putting into place for these particular students. Hopefully that helps. We're going to be diving into this even deeper over the coming weeks. And so definitely stick with us. If this is something that is new to you or you're interested in, we'd also love to have you join us in our Delivering Smarter Intervention training program, where we really talk a lot about each of these and dive into what does intervention really look like that hits each one of these areas and how do you pull that all together.